Tabulata Occulta, as above, so below, and in the model too.
What hapax legomena are lurking in your mortuarn daxrat? Latent space leches on this episode of Tabulata Occulta. Hello everyone, welcome to the premiere episode of Tabulata Occulta, our podcast / videocast looking at the intersections between large language models and other machine learning with the occult and the spiritual. I'm your host, Owen Ferguson, joined as always by a premier expert, Matthew Skala, and today we're going to be talking specifically about the concept of digital cryptids. But before we get into that, I thought we would start with a brief discussion of what's been in the news lately. This week, the most interesting thing that I've come across has been a lot of people talking specifically about the Grok large language model / image generation model and how it's being used / misused by people who are essentially creating various types of what some would consider objectionable imagery with it. Matt, you got any insights into the current discussion?
Well, you know, they added this so-called edit button to images, and I was a bit surprised when I first saw that on Twitter. And okay, so you can click on an image, any image someone's posted on Twitter, and you can enter "take her clothes off," and it will make some attempt at doing that. Now, you know, that's not a whole lot different from what I might do in my own imagination, just looking at the image. But people see it as really being a big deal that now the machine will do it for you. I guess it's a little bit like in the back of the comic books, you know, where they would sell the X-ray specs that will let you apparently see through clothes, skin, etc. I remember the wording exactly. And I don't know how many of us ever actually got to try those X-ray specs, but if you did try it, you will know what they actually did and were rather disappointing. But to some extent, it doesn't even matter because we have our own imaginations. And there's a certain class of people who would really, really like to take away imagination, and a machine that helps the imagination or makes it more visible is a machine that must be stopped. That may be one way of looking at what it comes down to. Now, of course, some would say, oh, well, that's crass. There's real harm being done by the Grok edit button. And I think it's a little early to know what the real consequences will be. From Twitter's point of view, Twitter has been searching for relevance for years. They'll just do anything to try to become something that people will care about again. And I see this as another attempt, and it's probably not going to be any more successful than the last 2 or 3.
Yeah, now I have seen apparently Indonesia has specifically banned this type of technology. Apparently Malaysia is looking at following suit. I was at a dinner the other night with a bunch of people and talked about the fact that we were launching this podcast. And they had, one of the older people there asked specifically, like, what kind of legislation do we need in order to protect us from this kind of technology? I think you and I are pretty much on the same page in the understanding that legislation is such a slow-moving process that it's pretty much ineffectual at preventing access to emerging technology, in as much as technology becomes so widespread, widely available before anyone can get legislation on the books that is precise enough to quote-unquote protect against it without at the same time widely preventing us from all manner of other types of important exploration in the sciences, most importantly computer science.
Well, yeah, I mean, even if you like legislation, I think the bigger issue isn't even just that legislation's the wrong thing to do, as that legislation shouldn't be the first thing to do. We're trying to solve problems that haven't happened yet and foresee them. And that's very difficult with any tool. And it's especially difficult with legislation. It's the same thing we see with these AI singularity doomsday issues, that someone says, oh, well, it's just like an asteroid hurtling towards Earth, and there's not a moment to be lost. Well, it probably doesn't even exist, let alone being just like an asteroid that you can predict with Newton's laws. So trying to craft a legislative solution to whatever problems you foresee, even problems that have actually happened, but mostly it's problems that have not yet happened, it's nearly certain that you'll end up making serious mistakes and then have a hard time unwinding them. Because once a prohibition is on the books legislatively, it's never coming back. So we have, I think before asking what kind of new rules do we need, we should be asking, are new rules the thing that we need? And almost certainly the answer is no. And that's even if you think that there is a problem to be solved, which I'm not absolutely convinced is the case. Now, you mention Malaysia and Indonesia, and that highlights something else that's really important about Twitter, which people in North America don't understand, which is that Twitter is global. And it's much bigger in some other places than in the English-speaking world. And even in the English-speaking world, your English-speaking world may be different from someone else's. I go on Twitter and it's just a few clicks before I get to I get to spaces within Twitter, and I don't mean whatever if they have something named spaces. I just mean different sections of the latent space, as it were, as we'll get to later, where I not only don't speak the language, but I don't recognize any of the cultural references. We saw this actually when Mastodon became a big thing, that a lot of people moved from Japanese Twitter to Mastodon, and English users on Mastodon were completely baffled by this because they didn't understand that Twitter is or was huge in Japan. And the Japanese population of Twitter was much bigger than the English-speaking population of Twitter. And so if a significant fraction of Twitter moves onto Mastodon, yes, that means Mastodon becomes Japanese. And the English speakers on Mastodon had no expectation of that. They didn't know that they were a minority to begin with. And then they were surprised when they were confronted with that. So if we see something like this with Twitter and their introduction of AI image editing, the American, North American, US, English-speaking culture, they shouldn't expect their values to be the ones that will determine what happens. And they shouldn't expect that they're going to get to call the shots because they're a minority and they don't know it. And this sort of thing happens a lot with other social networks too, especially social networks that are declining. With LiveJournal, right? People didn't realize that LiveJournal was basically Russian. And when the company was eventually sold to a Russian media concern, the English speakers were shocked because they didn't realize that they were already a tiny minority before that happened. And they were only confronted with it after it did happen. So I don't know, Twitter has the huge wild card of Elon Musk calling shots for it at the moment. But to the extent that it reflects its user population, that won't be the English speakers or the Americans.
Fair. Yes, that's a huge consideration that, as you say, I think a lot of people completely overlook. Personally, I have been banned from Twitter for like 15 years at this point because I told someone who was trying to sell specifically products to prevent school shootings. They were claiming that school shootings were much more prevalent than fire, and so school shooting safety was more important than fire safety. And I explicitly told them to go die in a fire.
Right.
Apparently that is not allowed. And so I haven't been on Twitter in ages, but I will take your word for...
well, I no longer actively use it myself, but and that, funnily enough, is the final straw for me was just when they made it so that you couldn't read it from the general web and you had to have an account.
Booting wetware interface in 5, 4, 3.
All right. So in the introduction, I mentioned the concept of the hapax legomena, which is something I came across in one of the lectures on your site, MatthewExplains.com, which just shout out amazing in-depth analysis of various academic papers specifically relating to machine learning and the deep concepts involved in that. Highly recommended to any of our listeners that they give that a look. There are a wide variety of freely available lectures where you only have to sign up with your email address to access them. And from the first one, I was learning things that I had no idea about. Anyway, why don't you talk about that concept for us, and we'll use that to bridge our way into the discussion of digital cryptids and what they mean in various definitions.
All right. So hapax legomena or hapax legomena, I'm not quite sure on what's the preferred pronunciation. I think both are to some extent considered valid. That refers to a word or phrase that only happens once in a given book or work or corpus, right? And this often is something that you'd encounter when you're talking about ancient documents that, well, we read the the complete works of Plato or something, and he used this word and he only used it once. Now, that's not necessarily going to be a word that we don't know what it means, but very often there's a correlation, right? If he only used it once, then we are often left to guess at what he intended that word to mean, even if we may be able to find the word somewhere in some larger corpus. If we can go look at other philosophers, maybe they use that word as well. Maybe it stops being a hapax legomenon once we are looking at a big enough corpus. But something that's unique in that way is a hapax legomenon, plural hapax legomena. And the word sounds kind of funny because it's a technical term derived from Greek. I remember when I was working at U of Waterloo, I was working for a while with a professor of rhetoric, classical rhetoric, and all the technical terms from his field were derived from Greek. This was one of them. Whereas coming from science and engineering, I'm accustomed to technical terms that derive from Latin, and they sound different.
Yes, it is. It's an interesting term and an interesting concept. In the lecture, you talk about how it's something that's a fairly considerable concern when constructing specifically token sets based on information scraped from the web, because with there being so many PGP keys and other essentially unique strings out there, there are, I wouldn't say infinite, but approaching infinite number of potential hapax legomena that can clog up your data set and end up producing tokens that have only one reference across the entire training set.
Right. The way that people tend to build language models these days, they start with a token set, a list of words, and whatever text you put in needs to be reduced to a sequence of words from the list. And that's a problem because of, as you say, hapax legomena, there may be a word or a thing that's like a word that shows up in just one place on the entire web. PGP keys are great for that because you can easily compute the likelihood, and it turns out there are going to be many of them out there. It's a little bit like a book out of the Library of Babel. Anyway, so in tokenization for language models, people try to solve that or resolve it by having some sort of fallback that will also have a token for each letter of the alphabet. And then if we can't encode a given word, we will just split it into its alphabet letters. But the token lists that people use may be like 100,000 tokens long. They end up being automatically compiled. And there is some question of how do you do that automatic compilation to get a good token list. And there's also been a trend of people sort of working the other way, saying we will look at the token list of this model and try to infer things about the intentions of the people who created that model, or even infer things about the bias inherent in the model. I've seen people attempt to ascribe political alignments to the presence and absence of specific things in the token list. I don't know how well that works, but the fact that people try to do it is significant, and this makes it this makes it a real issue. How are you going to choose your token list? And leading into other things we plan to talk about, if you see something really weird that made it onto the token list, you end up asking why. Is this a thing that's actually more significant or more common than we would have expected?
I think that's a good bridge into a discussion of Loab, which was, in my understanding, the first really wide popularization of the notion of a digital cryptid or a specific quote-unquote entity living in the latent space. Just for those unfamiliar with it, Loab was a character discovered by an artist, Steph Madge Swanson, in 2022. Essentially, the process that she went through was she asked a model to generate an image that was the opposite of Marlon Brando. And the result was a city skyline with the words Digita Pnitics, Pntics. She then asked for the opposite of that phrase, Digita Pnitics. And the result was fairly, I wouldn't say distraught, but essentially a very angry and disfigured looking older woman. She then did some reinterpretation of those same images, of that image, and got some other images that were similar, and drew the probably tenuous conclusion that this was a specific entity living in the latent space. I'll throw some images up so people can take a look at what we're talking about here. But essentially, that discovery, as it were, was widely popularized, and so people started creating additional images using that specific four-letter name, which, as far as I could tell, was a hapax legomena prior to her work. And the results then ended up being incorporated into new models that were being built. And now we are at a point where if you put Loab into one of the most modern iterations of some of these models, they immediately generate that same kind of image of a older woman with somewhat surrealistically gory / angry countenance.
Yeah,
I remember when it initially was a phenomenon that was being discussed. You wrote something fairly extensive based on your understanding of her process, which turned out to not actually be the process that she underwent to generate the images, but that provided some insight, at least for me, into how, specifically into some research you'd done earlier in your career about finding the furthest two places up, the furthest most separated places in an n-dimensional space when trying to analyze it for these sort of internal distances between likelihoods.
right. I kind of ended up with egg on my face with that episode, because when I first encountered the Loab concept, I thought that the claim was that basically the same character was appearing in many different furthest point queries. That you could say, well, find me the image that is furthest away from this prompt or furthest away from this image or whatever, and it would show up a picture of Loab, and it would keep doing this with multiple different queries. And so I wrote on Twitter a lengthy thread that went through the theoretical basis for how that could possibly happen, and in particular, why it wouldn't necessarily mean that we'd summoned a demon. And that thread proved very popular, and I got hundreds of new followers from it, and so on. And afterward, I figured out that the artist had taken her original Loab image, and she was including that in the prompt in her subsequent experiments, and then saying, oh, isn't it surprising that the character appears again in my new image when I prompted using that same character? So I don't know if that was a deliberate deception, or if I had just not read the original announcement carefully enough, or what. What seemed remarkable to me is that the audience I acquired from my thread didn't seem to care. Nobody called me on the mistake, even though I pointed it out myself. So whatever, and I mean, the theoretical basis that I was looking at remains true. That doesn't mean that I would necessarily expect Loab to appear in furthest point queries, but it would be unsurprising if something like her did, or if not necessarily a picture of a person, but some specific image or even symbol might tend to appear, just because of the way that these high-dimensional spaces work. Now, we probably don't need to go into all of the details of that right now, because we could be here for the rest of the episode. But in very brief terms, it's a fact that when you have data in a high-dimensional space, often it doesn't really use all the dimensions. And so when you try to go as far as you can in your data cloud, as it were, often the cloud is sort of cigar-shaped. You're going to end up at one of the two ends. And so even in very high dimension, when you look for things that are far apart from other things, there may be less diversity in the answer to that question than you would expect. So it's not unreasonable. And other people commented on this and came up with some good reasons to suspect that it would even be likely that what you would find this way would be a face.
Yes, and specifically, you remember at the time people were saying that if they were, this is before the images started to be repurposed in new models, and thus associating between the Loab token and those specific types of images. There was some speculation that it was just this similarity to the name Loeb from the singer Lisa Loeb, and so the machines were creating a female face simply because that was the closest association they could come up with when they were doing the diffusion out of a prompt that included the term Loab. And that actually brings me on to the second major digital cryptid to gain popular notice, which is Crungus, discovered by a streamer / comedian called Guy Kelly, also around 2022. And he apparently came to the realization that if you search the term Crungus, which up to that point had not been a word for anything, it would produce specifically an ogre-like creature, images of an ogre-like creature. And that ultimately, people realized that was a very similar word or similar term to the name Odorous Ferungus, who is the lead singer of the band War, and wears a costume that looks quite ogre-like. And there the supposition was that, again, the machine was finding a term that was similar enough phonetically, and so it was like, oh, anyone who's anything that has the prefix ungus in it, they're looking for an image of something that is ogre-like.
Yeah, now, if I could say one other thing about Loab before we go on to Crungus, it's that
Sure.
Everybody is referring to Loab as a woman, but the original image looks quite androgynous, and in particular is of a person with very visible beard stubble. So this is very much a human interpretation that we're imposing on it, that we would say, oh, this is a picture of a woman. I don't even know where that interpretation came from. I would just say this is a picture of a person. But this shows to some extent the way that we will very quickly start imposing human assumptions on what comes out of the machine. Now with Crungus, I'm reminded of the whole Kiki and Booba thing, right? You can show a person two abstract images, and you say one of these is Kiki and one of them is Booba, which is which, and you can make it very consistent that they will guess that the one with the sharp points is Kiki and the one with the rounded curves is Booba. And that this is among psychological results in, psychological research is often scientifically questionable, but this is one of the ones that reproduces pretty well. I'm inclined to think that we're seeing something similar to that with Crungus, and then it may be enhanced by the connection to Guar, that if you ask a human, if we tell you there's a creature called a Crungus, what does a Crungus look like? The human may well guess something like what the model guesses.
Indeed, yeah. I'm just thinking back. I remember that the ancillary works that Swanson created from the initial Loab image. I think that's where the general notion that Loab is a woman came from. I don't know if that's because they were being interpreted by Swanson, who is a woman, or if that is just.
Well, that could also be Lisa Loab, right?
It may also be
that connection didn't necessarily have to only be the model making it.
Indeed, yeah. Well, let's talk for a minute about what latent space is, because it's a term that gets used a lot in machine learning discourse, but it's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people have a really hard time visualizing for themselves, if that's even possible. Yeah. It's myself, I think of it kind of as analogous to outer space, in as much as there's I think of all the different galaxies and planets as different sort of dimensions and subdimensions, and it's just sort of so expansive that one can't really comprehend the entirety of it in any one segment. But as a professional ML researcher, what do you do when you have to explain what latent space is to someone in a manner that they can fit in their brain?
Okay, well, on the one hand, oh yes, it's this vast, unimaginable concept, and yet on the other hand, it's something that we all already know about intuitively, because we talk about things being close together and far apart, even when they are abstract things that do not have location in any sensible way. You say, well, I've got 10 books here. These 2 books are almost the same. And this other book is totally different because it's a nonfiction book, and the 2 fiction books, the Harry Potter is a lot like, I don't know what, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, although we can also quickly think of important differences between them. We have this intuitive notion of things being close together or far apart. Well, what if we could make that more specific? What if we could put a number on it? What if we could say, these 2 things are distance 3, and that other thing over there is distance 10 from either of them, okay? Once you start trying to put numbers on the distances among things, then you are implying that they actually have locations in a space. Now, the distance, it may be hard to come up with a way of finding the numbers. And once you do have these numbers, you may find that the numbers are not consistent with any very simple space, all right? You can have 3 points in ordinary 3-dimensional space, and you measure the distances between them. There are constraints on what those distances can be, right? You can't have something, oh, it's very close to this point, but it's also far away from the other points that are close to that point. So it starts to become harder and harder as you have more things and more complicated distances to fit them into a nice space. But you can always, if you push it into enough dimensions, and if you make some reasonable mathematical constraints, you can always come up with some sort of space that they will fit into, especially if you're willing to make it be sort of approximate. So this is something that shows up a lot in machine learning. We want to measure how close things are to each other, and it can go in both directions. We come up with some way, which may be very complicated, of measuring similarity, and that gives us distance numbers. But it also can be that once we've got those distance numbers, we can associate our points, whatever they are, the things that we're looking at, with points in some sort of space, and then we can go the other direction. We say, now that we've got our points in space, we can do geometry on them. We can compute more distances in an easier way. We can apply techniques like matrix multiplication and vectors and stuff that exploit the nature of the space that we think we've discovered. So there's this idea that we have a space, and concepts or things or words or whatever it is we're looking at exist in this space. The space is created by our idea of things being similar or not, but it also seems to have some significant reality to it, that in at least some extent, we can analyze the distances in more than one way and come up with the same space, or a space that's easy to map between two concepts of distance. This is what we usually mean when we talk about latent space. It may have a much more specific definition in certain contexts. Very often language models have defined it. We have a space with a set number of dimensions. Here is how we put things in it, etc. But it's a concept of arranging things spatially to represent our intuitive notion of things being similar or not.
Oh, and I guess sort of the presumption then that lies behind the notion of digital cryptids is that within that space as it exists, specifically in image creation models, there will be areas where there's no actual, what I would say, real intrinsic content from the training, where there may develop specific loci where the machine has an understanding of a thing that is X distance from thing 1, Y distance from thing 2, Z distance from thing 3, and therefore is a thing in and of itself, but not one that it has learned from the corpus that it's training.
To some extent, yes. I mean, once we've defined a space, we can say, are there mismatches between this space and whatever is our intuitive notion? That we can say, you know, we have two things that are far apart, and the structure of the space implies something in between them. What would that thing look like? We can ask questions about things that did not exist in the training. We can do extrapolation. We can say, okay, I'm going to move from this picture of me towards the picture of you, but then I'm going to move even further on the other side. Where do I end up? And it's easy to construct questions like that, and it's easy to find answers to them using generative models, because the generative model, you might say it doesn't care, it just does a mapping between points in the space and whatever it is it's generating.
Yes, I'm kind of reminded of a thing you touched on in your What's a Model lecture on your site. Another great free lecture that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in these topics. Specifically about how a model is continuous even if the data that it's trained on is not. And so the surface that it creates in however many dimensions it's creating that surface, there are going to be what has commonly come to be termed hallucinations for all of the places on that surface where the surface's shape has been calculated, but there's no actual input that has created that particular point on the surface.
Right. I mean, continuity of models, really that depends on exactly what model we're talking about, but it's a feature that they very frequently have. And I mentioned extrapolation, saying I'm going to go in this direction, but even further than the data. You can also do interpolation. You can say, I'm going to find the point in between these two. What does it look like? Even if there was no such point in the training data. The model can infer things from the patterns that its training has found, even if those things do not necessarily refer to and may even contradict what was content in the model, in the training. Something important to remember is that when models are trained, the final model ends up being much smaller than the collection of all the training data that went into it, ordinarily anyway. And so there's always something lost. And then when you do generation, there's something being filled back in a way that we might imagine as random or averaging out. And that can sometimes have very surprising features to what actually comes out. We can talk about what is hallucination as opposed to memorization and so on. But the point is that as humans using it, we can often be surprised by what comes out. And it's not at all clear where some of this comes from, whether it's really recognizing things that were in the training data and we just didn't know, or if it's coming from somewhere else. And the idea of things coming from somewhere else is, of course, of great interest mystically.
Yes, and that's hopefully something that I think we'll be diving into further in future episodes, because that's sort of our focus here is what are the mystical implications of this new technology, more so than sort of the sociological and legal implications, which there are already a plethora of content out there covering. When we were prepping for this episode, you had mentioned that you were unsure about the specific definition of digital cryptids, and that you were particularly more interested in the work that you've been doing, trying to have models analyze literature that you've created and pull out information about the individual characters involved in that. Would you like to speak on that a little?
Sure. I mean, I don't know what a cryptid is. So if we're going to have a talk here about cryptids, maybe we're going to say, well, a cryptid is whatever you don't know what it is, but that quickly becomes self-referential. I think that the most interesting kinds of cryptids are not if you ask the model, show me something weird. It's if you ask the model what ought to be a straightforward question, and then it gives you a weird answer. Okay? So I've done a number of experiments where I feed a piece of literature, often one that I've written myself, but it doesn't have to be, a story into a model, and I ask it the kinds of questions a high school English teacher might ask. Okay, what are the themes in this story? And what I quickly found is that with the relatively small local models that I've been playing with, the models are so bad at doing that that it's not even worth asking the question. And so I step back and look at even simpler literary type questions like, who are the characters in this story? And it's remarkable what happens when the models start to hallucinate on that. Okay, I showed a model, I think it was probably Quen 3. I showed it a short story about someone going to a crossroad and trying to sell his soul to the devil. Okay, nice basic story there. The devil never shows up. So the model was supposed to give me a list of the characters who do show up. And in addition to the characters who are actually mentioned, I made multiple trials with different variants of the prompt. It kept trying to list the cat. The cat. I had to read the story carefully to even figure out that there was a cat mentioned at all. But even after telling it, no, only list human characters. Pretend that we're casting for a film. Only list the characters for which we actually need actors. It just kept trying to list the cat. And it also kept trying to list the devil, even though an important part of the story is that the devil never shows up and would not have an actor. So the model only has an imperfect understanding of the story. And it kept also trying to list the Zamboni driver, who is about as relevant as you would expect. So it has some understanding of what's going on in the story that includes these characters who weren't actually in the story. So what is it looking at? It's looking at some sort of inferred, approximated version of the story, probably within the latent space, if you will. We can imagine that there are other versions of the story besides the ones I actually showed it. And it's showing me characters from those other versions. That seems to be what's going on. And it would be really interesting, now I haven't established this, I don't know that it happens, if there were some characters like that who started appearing in other stories. And that would point at the idea that somewhere deep in the space, the model has a preference for producing this character. That would be something like the Loab phenomenon happening at the level of words instead of pictures.
Yes, you mentioned the difficulty with the definition of the term cryptid. I'm familiar with it in, I guess you would call it conspiracy discourse, specifically referring to unknown, not unknown, but mythical creatures like the Jersey Devil, Sasquatch, all of these sort of rumored to exist but never actually proven entities, which is why I figured that this might be a good introductory episode for the concept that we're trying to look at here. Just looking at the crossover between the notion of imagined entities and machines and their ability to quote unquote hallucinate things into people's output and into the popular culture, as we've seen with the Loab and Crungus examples. On my own end, and doing some research, I wouldn't call it research, but doing some poking around with models prior to this episode, I specifically got interested in nanobanana, which was in the news a few cycles further back than the current discussion about Grok's particular, let's call it, all of this nonsense with Grok. I'm not going to try to find the right word to describe what Grok is doing and what people are doing with it. But anyway, I specifically started asking nanobanana to try to create user accessible maps of the latent space and where in the latent space one might be most likely to find digital cryptids. And it narrowed it down. It gave me a map, which I'll throw up on screen, and it narrowed it down to what it defined as 4 different areas in the latent space, which I think are probably more poetic than scientific, but it specified the glitch nexus, the chaotic region defined by corrupted data and fragmented code, the uncanny valley, an area near humans but unsettling representations, where data struggles to resolve into familiar forms, the deep dream void, a recursive hallucinatory expanse where patterns are endlessly amplified, and the noise barrier, an unstructured outer boundary of latent space, the realm of pure static and randomness. And I was just reminded of the uncanny valley one when we were having the initial discussion about Loab, because I think part of what people found so unsettling about that image was not just the way that it was initially arrived upon, but the traditional uncanny valley response that's been documented since the dawn of CGI human form. And I think that really defines for me what is so interesting about diffusion-based image generation in particular, is that it is getting so much closer to removing the uncanny valley aspect from the images that it generates, because they're being generated in that particular process rather than from the ground up, as one would, or at least as I would define sort of traditional CGI generation methods, where you try to create a human based on creating the skeletal system and the musculature and then overlaying skin onto that, and instead approaching image generation from the idea or from the process of removing noise from essentially 100% noise-based base images.
Yeah, I mean, you were playing with these image generators since even before I was, and I remember seeing the progression that for a while, you know, you could see the image and everyone would know, oh yeah, you got it out of such and such generator. And I think now we're at the point where part of the reason people are so angry about Grok is that we've passed the uncanny valley, and it's generating things that are not obviously fake. And people who want to who want it to be visibly fake will still say that they can tell the difference. I'm not even going to enter into whether they really can anymore, but it's certainly at the point where a layperson would have trouble. And that changes the significance of having a generated image, because of course then, you know, for many years it's been the case that you couldn't really trust a photograph, but people have been trying to anyway. And we were still in the space where we thought that we could trust a photograph as proving that the thing it's a photograph of really existed at some point or really happened at some point. And this means now we're in a different kind of uncanny valley where we can no longer even trust things that are super realistic.
Yes, I remember that debate going back to at least the Kennedy assassination with that famous photo of Oswald holding a rifle. And it's been a contentious debate ever since about whether the
We have to face the question now, not only can we not trust photographs, should we ever have trusted photographs?
Yeah, fair enough. That's one to ponder. Anyway, I'm going to throw up an image of the map that was generated when I was doing this work with NanoBanana, because in addition to the 4 regions that it identified in the text readout that it gave me for the image, it also identified a 5th image or a 5th region on the image that wasn't listed in the text, and that was simply labeled mortuarn daxrat, which I've done a ton of work trying to find any other reference to that anywhere in the corpus with both internet searches, and I've run queries on every model I have access to asking for any kind of information on it, with the most the closest any of the images or any of the models have been willing to say is that it sounds like it might be a D&D character from someone's private game. But I think we may have, just with that one simple query, stumbled upon another hapax legomena that could, maybe we can somehow hashtag it, tie it to our broadcast here, and seek out the same kind of fame that the Loab and Crungus generators have generated, which is marginal at best, I would imagine.
Well, the first thing I notice about that phrase, of course, is that the first word is almost identical to mortuary. You just have to change the last letter. And that may be some clue of what it connects to. But this also raises a phenomenon that, again, this isn't exactly a cryptid, but it seems like a cryptid, that these image generator models, and this was more true back when they were less good than they are now, they have this habit of generating text in an image that almost sounds like language but isn't quite. And that text does seem to be connected with the content of the image, that you can take some words that appeared in your generated image and you feed those back into a prompt and it will generate related images. It seems like this is a connection between the image generator's latent space and language, that it could almost be said that it's like the image generators have their own language. And I have even heard claims, although I'm not sure how far I trust this, that it goes across models, that, well, as we saw with Crungus, but maybe also with mortuarn daxrat, that two different image generators, given that phrase, may generate images that are in some way connected. It suggests that there's a connection between language and imagery on a deeper level and not exactly the same thing as any human language, even though it would seem that it has to have come from human language in some way.
Well, that's certainly something that I hope to get into in deeper in further episodes.
Everybody loves, everybody loves the idea that there's a universal language that is fundamental to our brains. The Snow Crash was all about this. And this feels like it's a similar concept, although I suspect that, like so many other things, if we look really closely, we may find that it's less exciting than we hoped.
Yes, you sent me an article a while back about this notion that perhaps the different models are communicating with each other in their own special language, using humans with special non-human readable prompts in order to affect that communication. I think that's definitely something that might be interesting to get into in future. But I think we're probably getting close to where we want to cut off the conversation in this initial episode, so people aren't stuck here with us for hours on end.
Fair enough.
Immanentizing feedback loop in 5, 4, 3.
All right, welcome to the feedback loop section. This is where we answer questions from people who have made comments on the posts or who have sent us questions directly to our email address, Tabulata Occulta at gmail.com. We're always open to learning from you, learning more about the things that you're interested in, and then telling them back to you. But since this was the initial episode, we don't really have that kind of content to work from, so I thought we'd just take a few moments to give you some background on your presenters here. My name is Owen Ferguson. I am a writer and editor of 25 years, focusing primarily on technology and how humans and technology interact. I've been focusing more and more extensively on large language models in the past few years, as they sort of take over the field that I came up in. And I'm always interested in learning more about how they specifically affect people who work in the arts. Matt, want to give people a rundown on you and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Matthew Skala. I wear a number of hats, even if I'm not wearing a hat right now. And I run a company called North Coast Synthesis Limited, which has generally focused on Eurorack modular synthesizers. I design and build modules for creating electronic music. In the last year or so, and moving into the present time, I have been focusing more and more on my video subscription site, which is called Matthew Explains, where I give something that I see as like an online graduate seminar in especially machine learning and artificial intelligence. I do a number of other things. I've written some fiction from time to time. In the past, I have been involved in academic research. I did 7 years of postdocs in different places, including Toronto, Winnipeg, and Copenhagen. So I have some background in computer science. That's what I did my PhD in. But at the moment, my main focus is on artificial intelligence and, to some extent, electronic music.
Yes, and we met at Waterloo when you were doing that doctoral work. And I think one of the main reasons why we connected is that we both approach life with what I like to consider the Waterloo way, which is to essentially not trust anyone else and build everything yourself. And it's one of the things that I find most impressive about your work, specifically your video site, is that you have created your own platform from the ground up and essentially approach being an online content creator as something that requires a foundational understanding in what being online means from a personal liberty point of view, which is to say creating and maintaining control over 100% of your own work product. It's an approach that I take in my own work, both from the work that I've done as a publisher, publishing my own books and books that I translated from other languages for academics, and also in politics. When I still lived in Canada, I currently reside in Oaxaca, Mexico. But in Canada, I was ran for member of parliament, which is a provincial parliament, not national parliament, a number of times, but always as an independent, because I grew up working for various different political parties and realized rather rapidly that each of the different political parties existed more as apparatuses to control and stifle debate rather than encourage them. And so I just couldn't in good faith claim to be representing both a constituency and a party. I see the role of the legislative representatives as representing their constituents, not any overarching party values.
Squaring down the circle in 5, 4, 3.
All right, so this is the end of episode 1. We'll start with a summary of some key takeaways. I think for me, the largest takeaway is that for the most part, we don't see any proof in the existence of currently recognized quote-unquote digital cryptids of entities inhabiting the latent space. And that in general, the notion of what defines a cryptid is kind of hard to pin down in any specific direction. Matt, any big takeaway for you from this?
I would certainly like to believe that there are cryptids inhabiting the latent space, but in order for that to be true, we have to come up with a good definition of what that would mean.
All right, well, listeners, in the comments, let's hear what you have to say. Do cryptids exist, both in the real world and in the digital world? If so, how do we define them? How do we find them? How do we document them? And how do we, expunge them if that's what we want? Or how do we encourage them if that's what we want?
I'd rather breed them.
Yeah, how do we breed them with each other to make super cryptids? I'm going to end the quote, or end the section with the quote and then some AI generated prophecies. Our quote for the episode is, "There are creatures in this world that prey on men. From the time we were children, we were told that monsters don't exist. The truth is, they do." That's from codename Wild Hunt by D.A. Roberts. As for the prophecies this time around, I asked a bunch of different models that I have access to generate a 7-word prophecy about digital cryptids. Specifically, the prompt was, provide a 7-word prophecy about the discovery of more digital cryptids. Kimmy K2 said, hidden code shall awaken ancient digital beasts. Quen3 said, more digital cryptids will emerge soon. Llama4 Maverick said, Glitches reveal hidden beasts in code depths. Claude Opus 4.5 said the forgotten code awakens beneath silicon dreams. Gemini 3 Pro said lost code awakens monsters in the machine. GPT 5.2 said hidden code awakens, new digital cryptids emerge. DeepSeek R1 said deepest codes hatch glitches to surface. And Grok 4.1 fast parentheses reasoning said more digital cryptids emerge from binary abyss. Also, I think I mispronounced silicon as silicone in Claude's response. So that was the forgotten code awakes beneath silicon dreams. Silicone dreams are something else entirely.
Grok can help with
I'll
those
leave it
too.
at that for our younger viewers to think about. Finally, anywhere that you want to push people, Matt?
Well, we've already mentioned Matthew Explains, but I'd also like to encourage people to read my story, The Number 13 Road, and see if you can understand it better than the models do, which will not be difficult.
I would also encourage people to check out 11freedoms.org. That's the word 11 and then the word freedoms.org. That's a kind of a manifesto, I guess I would call it, that Matt created, and I helped with a bit of the copy editing on. It really breaks down some of the really important issues facing people working in this space in computer science that are being pretty much ignored by everyone who's commercializing product in the machine learning arena. Really, really important considerations that are completely overlooked in most discourse. Finally, I want to plug our next episode. Currently, the working title is Technology a Religion? Is it? I don't know. We'll see. We'll have to define both those words to actually get an answer. But that is the proposed title. It may actually be something entirely different. So tune in next time to see where we go from here.
Ending transmission in 5, 4, 3,